Welcome back. I'm here with Captain Bryant Baker. He is a Judge Advocate General with the Air Force, but he is not here in this capacity today. He has written a number of thought pieces over the years, very, very slowly, Bryant. You need to come out with more of them and faster, about space and space law, because that's his field. He is a space lawyer. And I was pretty interested to see this recent one called Moon Wars that came out. I'll link to it in the description below. Because I've been getting back into geopolitics and, what's America and China going to do? What's going to happen? And the rules are not great. The rules are not very structured or clear. And your article goes into that. So thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's definitely important to keep in mind before we get started. Standard disclaimer for anyone who works in government. My opinions are my own and don't necessarily reflect the stances, policies, procedures, or anything like that for any organization, to include the Department of Defense. And in this particular instance, it's especially important because I don't do space law for the Air Force. I do a completely different kind of job, but space law is definitely my passion. Definitely where I see going in the future for myself. So I'm very happy to be here and talk through this sort of stuff.
Right. All right. I've got to build up my business so I can hire you when you when you undeploy. Okay. So reading through, I think I've identified the key issue here, which I'll spit out in a second. And then I've got a few question points after that. So it seems to be you're questioning, like, does the Outer Space Treaty capture and serve the current geopolitical issues? That's the main question. And so we had these Artemis Accords come out. Do they provide an example to work with? How much uncertainty as we move towards real operators on the moon have we got to deal with here?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. See, what I have observed in my study of the current setup, as well as the current conversation that seems to be happening within the space law and policy field, is that there are some who are confused and there are others who believe, no, we have to have some plan. There has to be something that says what people are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do that's going to, prevent us from shooting at each other in space. Mm-hmm. But my observation has been that although there is some structure, and I go through that in the article, I think that there's less structure than we would like to believe that we can really rely on. And when you get down to asking the question of, well, what if somebody ignores that? We don't have good answers in place. And that's kind of, there are several examples that I go through in this particular article, particularly with regards to stuff that's going on the moon, hence the title of Moon Wars. Mm-hmm. How are we heading in that direction, and what do we do about it, at least in a legal sense? And I agree with you, though, that my main thesis, if anything, I would say, is that there are more questions than there are answers at this point.
Right. Yeah. And I'm hoping that we will interest more people in reading the article, which again is linked to in the description below. So you kind of began with the dark side of the moon, far side of the moon landing by China recently. This was maybe a trigger, at least a kind of mental trigger. Everybody is looking at the south pole of the moon as a potentially attractive resource location. And so that is going to, when you have limited resources, and this is something that I've learned from my geopolitical study recently lately, when people get down to specifics, when opposing sides get down to specifics of geography, this island, this location, mm-hmm. that is when war is most likely to break out. It's not when they're talking about conceptual ideas, it's when they're down to physical locations here. And so here we have one, right? So, you brought up a number of great concepts like legwork, right? Does legwork matter? And let's define that, I guess. I'll have you define it. And then, does that matter when it comes to competition between, say, China and the USA?
So I don't try to go into a really solid definition of legwork in the article as much as use it as in a generalized sense. There are certainly some great experts that could tell you the different possibilities for doing mining on the moon or setting up locations on the moon. What that would mean infrastructure wise? Are we using roads on the moon as opposed to some sort of other transportation system, or a series of landing and taking off points to bounce around the moon. There's lots of really great ideas. So I don't try to necessarily define legwork, but the point that I bring up in the article is the fact that in the Outer Space Treaty, it does provide protections for nations that put items in space, in as much as we say, okay, if we put something in space or on the moon, you perpetually own that. So it's not like the United States puts something on the moon and then we lose ownership and anybody can come in and out. No, ownership remains. But those sorts of protections only apply to things on the moon. And one thing that I tried to emphasize, and was actually a fascinating part of the back and forth that I went with on the editors for this particular piece, was they would look at my earlier drafts and say, well, I'm not sure that there's really a problem here, because you put a moon base on the moon, nobody can come and just try to claim that because it belongs to the country that put it there. The point that I make, though, is yes, but what about the space around the moon base? There's no protections for that. What about the area that you're trying to mine from? What about the acres, if not square miles, that you're trying to process through in order to get to the important resources like water on the moon, or helium-3, or eventually other minerals and things like this? That's going to be important infrastructure that gets put in place that right now, at least in an international sense, does not have those same kinds of protections. And arguably, those are the important parts. So one example that I give in the article is, let's say that one nation lands on the south pole of the moon and starts setting up, roads to another launch point, or a series of infrastructure to be able to start extracting minerals from a certain area that we know is super resource rich, and they get it all set up so that the equipment can reach it easily. There's in and out points. There's a way of doing things. Well, as it stands right now, as long as a nation can do so without violating what's called a due regard requirement from Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, in theory, any other nation could come in and start taking advantage of all this work that has been done. All of a sudden, they're driving down your roads. They're taking advantage of the in and out points. Mm-hmm. They're profiting. Bottom line, they're profiting off of the economic inputs that the First Nation there really put into it. So the unanswered question is, no matter who is first there, will they be okay with that? Or should they, in fact, be given some right to make a claim over that area or over that infrastructure? Claims the rights of which don't exist right now in international law. And as you pointed out, and as I point out in my paper, where you have limited resources and an inability to use the law to start definitively saying, no, you can or cannot do that, that's where conflict comes in. And I think that everybody involved in this sort of industry or in these thought experiments can be on the same page to say, no, conflicts in space, bad idea. And we should be doing everything we can to avoid those sorts of conflicts.
Okay. Yeah, property rights are just not figured out there yet, right? And as was pointed out to me a long time ago, property rights are not about the relationships between people and things. They're about the relationships between people and other people and things. And so that due regard concept, which I don't fully have a handle on, is pretty key here. It seems to be kind of the pivot of a lot of these things. Like somebody could go and build a moon base, and then somebody else, an opponent, could come along, or and just build around it, right? And wall them in, like Berlin in the Cold War or something like that, right? And well, I don't know. We didn't trespass on your sovereign space there that you've got. There's no sovereign airspace as far as I could tell. out there like you have here. I'm not quite sure how high sovereign airspace goes before it becomes international space here, but there is a limit on Earth. And so, yeah, we don't have a lot of customary law about these things yet. Well, tell us a little bit more about due regard, I guess, and then maybe get into the possibility of lawfare as a potential way of fighting some of these things out.
So those definitely important concepts. So first, I'll talk a little bit about that idea of due regard. And the thing that I emphasize the most in this paper, and that I think is important to keep in mind, is that do we think that we have definitions of due regard? Yeah, there's plenty of good theories about what that means. But the bottom line that I try to get into in the paper is to say there is no one definitive definition of due regard that can be relied on by any one nation. As is so often the case in international law, what we have is a series of possible interpretations. But when you have conflicts of interpretations, that's where conflict comes in. So maybe so I'll use the example that was put out by the Artemis Accords when they were published. Actually, originally the Artemis Accords were published a few months after I originally started the first draft of this particular paper and had to do a lot of rewrites because of the Artemis Accords. So article, I think it's 12 of the, let me check on that. I'm sorry, article or section 11 of the Artemis Accords go into this idea of safety zones, where they would say, well, as one potential interpretation of this idea of due regard, we'll say that people who are signatories to the Artemis Accords can essentially put people on notice, put other nations on notice, publish an intent to land at a certain area and to establish this is how much space we think that we need in order to safely carry on the types of activities that we intend on doing in a certain area. So let's go back to your example that you brought up. Okay, so in that scenario, let's say that I want to land on a certain portion and I say I need 50 square kilometers, 100 square kilometers. In order to carry on the kind of mining that I want to be able to accomplish. This has two potential outcomes that are problems that I can think of at the moment. First off, well, what happens if you get started there and then through a series of continued observation and discovery, maybe from orbit, it's suddenly discovered that just outside of that 50 or 100 kilometer radius, there's a super resource rich area that's within striking distance of everything that's already there. They've got the equipment, they've got the ability to move it, but it's just outside that 50 kilometer radius that they originally said. Do they then have the right to move off of their original area and sort of quote unquote claim that additional area? Do they have to ask other nations first? Do they have to get permission? Can those other nations say, no, we disagree with you moving on to that other area? In fact, we plan on going to that area. How soon do they have to be prepared before it makes sense for the United States or whoever's already there to say, okay, then we won't go off to that new area as well? All these things are not quite laid out yet. And we can go back to the example that you gave. All right, well, let's say that we originally stake a 50 kilometer area. We say, okay, we want this safety zone to be here. Let's say that people or countries that are a little bit more antagonistic respect that. Let's say that they say, okay, well, we have no intention of going into that area then, but we decide to make claims all around that area to assure that there's no moving away from the original spot, regardless of the process or the success or failure of excavation at that particular area. There's some real potential there for concerns and problems that could be brought up. Again, it all goes to the bottom line of when concerns are unable to be properly discussed or solutions found, that's where you get conflicts coming out. And it brings up one additional problem with the current structure, both with the Outer Space Treaty, which both the United States and, for instance, China and Russia and other major space players are all signatories to. But the same problem exists for the Artemis Accords, which, of course, the United States has signed with several of its partners, but none of the other major space powers, such as China or Russia. They both have the same problem in that there's no enforcement mechanism included in them. So let's say the United States, for whatever reason, believes that something that China, for instance, is doing is in breach of due regard. Well, if China disagrees with that, there's no international court that we can turn to or other international process that we can go to force China's hand. Really, the best that we can do is somewhat of a standard fare in international law. We can say, we think you're doing it wrong. We can get upset and do things internally, like create sanctions or have other possibilities. But especially before the full lunar economy gets brought up, there is some question as to how much other economic or otherwise pain are we willing to apply to these other nations in the name of potential lunar future resources? Another unanswered question.
Yeah, I see serious potential issues here, Bryant. My history knowledge goes back to the colonial conflicts prior to the First World War, where people were, say, running all over Africa, and various small armies would run into each other, like at Fashoda, and say, well, now what? Right. And unfortunately, those parties had a system. They had that diplomatic system that we've talked about, where a long period of time could be taken to resolve this thing. It didn't need to be figured out in 48 hours. That was the problem that led to the First World War, was the time limit. And they had that post-Napoleonic treaty that enabled that concert of Europe thing to happen, where the diplomats could get together and hash it out and say, okay, China, you'll get this, in return, America will get that, right? But if we don't have something like that in place, right, as you say, what is the point, right? And then we're back to, well, anybody who's ever played any of the civilization games knows all about taking territory simply to deny it to the enemy. You may not even want it, but you're going to grab it because there it is, right? And you want to stop their expansion. And so I think there are historical elements that we can look back at for assistance in perspective, but we do need, and this is the problem with these high-level international bodies seem to take forever to make up their freaking minds, right? And to get something like that in place. And I don't know, it's almost like people have to die before, and an emergency has to happen before people take quick action on something like this, right? And then those things worry me. So let's finish up with this, Bryant. So folks can go and read your article. It's a very good primer to understanding the issues and sort of the very few Lego pieces that we have to play with here, right? It's not much. What would you like to see happen next? What would be a next step that regular Jason, regular Bryant reading could actually go and do or help out with in some way?
Well, the biggest things at this point, I think, are more awareness in the minds of policymakers that these questions are very much yet to be answered. Because if I had to get out my crystal ball and say, this is what I think is going to happen in the future, it would be this. It would be the steps on the moon and otherwise in space are going to be taken whether we're politically or legally ready for them or not. And fortunately, it seems like there is currently a big push to make that happen, both within NASA as well as within private actors like Blue Origin, SpaceX, and several others that are trying to get to the moon. So what I predict will be happening is we're going to see the potential for conflict before the political prevention mechanisms are in place. But if our policymakers, the considerations are there for understanding, okay, once we get there, this is what we do about it, then hopefully we can take the steps necessary to avoid conflicts, even if the friction is already in existence. And part of the reason why I think that that's the way it's going to work out is that inevitably, whoever gets there first is going to have some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages in creating this international custom. And so, as an example, one that I bring up in the paper is that back in the 1950s, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, one of the interesting legal ramifications of that act was that it created what some have called instantaneous customary international law, which is to say, Russia, by putting up an object in space which was flying over several other nations which in theory had sovereignty over their airspace, it instantaneously created a rule which has been since that time almost universally recognized and not challenged. And that rule is that there is a difference between airspace and outer space when it comes to ownership rights and sovereignty rights. In a similar way, whoever gets there first to the lunar surface, in many ways, I predict, is going to be writing the rules as they go. They're going to be establishing the precedent for which other nations are going to be internationally expected to adhere by. That being said, though, as we've talked about, whoever gets there first is also going to have to deal with the trouble of, okay, if they're going to be putting in tons and tons of money on setting up these infrastructures, they might be at the disadvantage of then having the follow-on coming up and trying to take advantage of that. So whichever nation, whether it be China in their big plans for the moon, or the United States with the Artemis project, or some other mixture, whoever gets there first is going to have a lot of advantages and disadvantages. And my prediction is that the reaction by different countries is going to depend on where they are in this pecking order in accomplishing these different tasks.
Excellent. Yeah. Big worries. Yeah. Gee, right. It's a nice road you built in the moon there. It would be a shame if somebody clogged that up with nonsense, right? Just to stop you from being able to use it, even if we can't do anything yet on our side, right? So there's all kinds of possibilities here, but I agree with you that, and I've thought this for the last year or so, that the operators are going to be the ones getting out there and creating reactions, right? Creating situations and then having to react to them. And so I hope that they'll have wargamed some of these out in a positive way and tried to figure out, okay, how can we do this without, shooting each other, which I think is, the potential. I don't know about blowing each other up, but certainly shooting each other. All right, where can people get a hold of you, Bryant? Connect with you? What's the best place to do that?
The places that I tend to be most active are on LinkedIn, but I'm also on Twitter, Facebook. My website is spacelawandpolicy.com. Very much a work in progress, but if you ever want to see what a lawyer can do tinker-wise in terms of websites, that's a place where you can check out work that I've done. Yeah, anywhere that you can find stuff, I tend to be hiding around.
Okay, I'll link to the website as well. I didn't know you had that. Well, I appreciate you doing this. Thanks for taking the time and the effort. Clearly, it was a while because we know the Artemis Accords came out some time ago now. in persisting with this, because it's easy to get shouted down. It's easy to get discouraged. It's a pain in the butt to have to do these extracurricular activities. But if you're just driven to do them, then you keep doing them. And I appreciate you putting in the effort and educating us with this. So I look forward to having you on again.
I appreciate it, Jason. The work that you are doing with your organization, the people you're talking to, the questions that you're asking are just absolutely spot on. So please keep it up. I find it very educational. Thank you.